from the News Channel 5 network. This is Urban Outlook.
And welcome to Urban Outlook. I'm April Eaton. Thank you so much for being with us today. You know, the numbers of women in the workplace have certainly skyrocketed. So has the rate of women who are working while they're expecting, while they're pregnant. And charges, believe it or not, of pregnancy discrimination in the workplace have also gone up. Now women are fighting back. They're trying to make sure that they are able to still get a paycheck and keep a healthy pregnancy. One organization that's helping in that cause, helping women fight some of these things that are happening to them in the workplace, is A Better Balance. Elizabeth Gedmark is the vice president of A Better Balance, and Kameron Dawson, staff attorney for the organization. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
You know, I did just a simple Google search of pregnancy discrimination and was amazed at the number of instances and cases that have popped up. There was one story that said there's an increase of pregnancy discrimination cases in the state of Philadelphia. There was one that talked about Frontier Airline and female pilots having to sue because they didn't have the proper accommodations. Even here at home, Belmont University, law students, former and current, are having a hard time with getting those same kinds of accommodations. So what in the world is going on?
It's a great question, and so at A Better Balance, we are a legal organization, and we leverage the power of the law to ensure that workers don't have to choose between caring for themselves or their loved ones and their jobs or their paychecks. And one very common form of that is pregnancy discrimination. So at A Better Balance, we see it all too often. And we hear from workers, and we represent workers who are pushed out of the workplace while they are pregnant just because they needed, for example, a modest accommodation. Something like a stool to sit on when their ankles were swelling, or a water bottle to stay hydrated. And there are others who face very simple pregnancy discrimination where their boss simply tells them, you need to go home now that you are showing, or right after they have talked about their pregnancy.
This is interesting because I think about there are probably some jobs where maybe being pregnant, you have to do that job differently. I'm thinking, suppose you work at a place where your job is to lift heavy weight of some sort, but then when you're expecting, you want to take care of that baby, and maybe you can't lift that same weight that you could before. So when you think about those scenarios, how is an employer supposed to kind of compensate for that? Or especially if they need that critical employee doing the job that they hired her to do?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, many women, even in those physically strenuous jobs, can continue to lift while they are pregnant, but there are a certain percentage who are not able to for various reasons, conversations with their doctor or other medical reasons, that they really do need some changes. And a lot of employers are making those types of accommodations, but the problem is that there's a lack of clarity in the law. And that's something that we have really been focusing on at A Better Balance, is saying we really need a new statute. We need clarity for those employers so they can understand what their obligations are, and their employees can understand what their rights are in these types of scenarios.
So I was reading pregnancy, and this is where you can come in, Kameron, staff attorney there. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act was passed in 1978. Is that law the law that's still in place, and what does it say?
Yes, ma'am. So that law is saying that pregnant women, pregnant workers are not allowed to be discriminated against simply for the fact that they are pregnant.
Okay.
They have to be treated the same as non-pregnant coworkers who are similarly situated in their ability or their inability to work. So we're finding, and we've done a report called Long Overdue, that 2/3 of women are, or 2/3 of workers who are alleging pregnancy discrimination are still losing cases because they have the burden of showing that the worker is not giving accommodations to other non-pregnant workers, or that their employee is finding workers and giving them light duty. But it shouldn't be on the burden of the employee to find those facts. A lot of times employees are siloed in their position. They're new to the job. They've just started within a year. So that they're not sure of those facts and those workers who have or have not gotten an accommodation before.
And what are you seeing specifically? What's happening to women once they are in a situation where they're showing they're expectant, what is being said, what is being done to sort of be that symbol of discrimination against them?
Well, I can give you one example of a case that we had. So these were clients of ours in Kentucky, actually, and they were police officers, and they were both pregnant. They were the only female officers on the force at that time. This was in Florence, Kentucky, and they requested light duty. Once they got to a certain point in their pregnancies, both of them, in conversation with their physicians, could no longer be out in the patrol car, wearing a really tight, heavy bulletproof vest and a heavy gun belt, and they wanted to have a light duty position that the city granted to other workers. So they said, if you have an on-the-job injury, then we'll give you light duty. But it was a policy that they wouldn't give it to anyone else, including pregnant workers.
Only if you had an injury.
Only if you had an on-the-job injury. So they had these places available where they could have been helping with paperwork, helping with detective work, and they said, no, because of this policy, we're just not going to let you have it at all. So at first, one of the workers was told that her health insurance would be cut off while she was pregnant, and I was with a very difficult pregnancy. We were able to.
And why would they cut the insurance off? Because she was in essence being working without pay, or off without pay?
Exactly, exactly. They said that you only get your health insurance if you get that paycheck.
Gotcha.
So that's what we see so often, is that folks are placed on unpaid leave, or they're even terminated. So this particular officer, Lindy Trischler, she and her one-year-old daughter had to move out of their apartment. They couldn't afford to pay the rent anymore. And the other police officer, they were working as light as they could. They were in great pain from having that heavy gun belt. So we see workers risking their health, and we see them sacrificing their economic security.
Some of this stuff seems like it's common sense. So why is there so much confusion about what should be done when you're talking about women who really just want to work through their pregnancy?
Well, what we're finding is that there is a lack of conversation between workers and their employers. And so during those conversations, there's not a framework of what's a reasonable accommodation. There's not a list of examples that could guide workers and employers in having that conversation. Many times they see that if they're not giving it to another worker, if they're only giving those accommodations to disabled workers, they don't have to give that accommodation to a pregnant worker. And so what we're finding is, with a statute like the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, we can give guidance, not explicit examples that employers have to stick to, but examples that could give them an idea of what a reasonable framework for accommodations are. This is the same framework that's used for disabled workers. And so although pregnancy is not a disability, we do feel that there needs to be a conversation between employees and employers so that they can make a way to keep workers safe on the job.
As I first started researching this topic, I was reading more and more stories about sort of the disparity of the women who were finding themselves filing pregnancy discrimination cases, and most of them were lower wage workers. But then when you see some of the cases, the female law students, for instance, and the pilots, these are not necessarily low-paying jobs. So it seems like this issue is one that impacts all women, no matter where they are on the pay scale.
It does affect all women, but those who are hardest hit, and where it usually happens more often, are the low-wage workers. They don't really have the bargaining power to ask for the accommodations that they need, and what they really need is a very clear law so that they have some grounding to ask for what they need. We hear from women who are too scared to turn in a doctor's note that has a request for some accommodation because they fear retaliation. They've seen it before at another workplace or from a friend. And what we also see is that women of color are really disproportionately affected by this problem. And that's because they're facing multiple layers of discrimination. So discrimination for being a woman and for being pregnant, as well as discrimination because of racism and those barriers that they face really every day. So that's very common in terms of the workers that we hear from and that call our free and confidential legal helpline. It's often working women of color.
And in fact, we've done some work with Think Tennessee in a report for our state of Tennessee, and about 83% of Black mothers are the head of their household. So when we're talking about how does this affect the economic impact of a family, how does this affect the health of Black mothers and women in general, this is going to have a disparate impact, especially on women of color. And so when we have callers call into our hotline, we're giving them guidance, but we're also seeing a problem and a pattern that needs to be fixed.
I'm curious, what kind of accommodations are we talking about? How robust is the list or simple is the list when we talk about accommodating a woman who is pregnant?
It really is common sense accommodations. It's things like a water bottle or more frequent water breaks to stay hydrated, a stool that you can sit on so that you're not standing on your feet all day. It might be a reprieve from heavy lifting if you can't lift over 50 pounds. It might even be more frequent restroom breaks. Believe it or not, we have heard those cases where an employer says, sorry, you can't take any additional restroom breaks, even though you were here 8 months pregnant.
Doctor's appointments, is that an issue?
Doctor's appointments is a huge issue.
And then
Absolutely.
once you have the baby, in the case of the pilots, they were saying that some of the allegations they had against Frontier Airlines was that they weren't, there were questions about them breastfeeding and having to pump during the day in order to make sure they had milk for the baby. Those kinds of things are not provided anymore in some businesses?
That's what we are hearing. And again, it is those low-wage workers in retail or in warehousing, those types of industries and sectors, they have a very difficult time getting what they need to under the law.
I want to take a quick break, and when we come back, let's talk more about what laws people should be on the lookout for, and then more about how your organization can help women through these issues. We'll be right back after this. Stay with us.